Sound it on the mountain, blow a trumpet in Zion, for the day of the Lord is come. Blow a trumpet in Zion, sound it on the mountains.
Blow a trumpet in Zion.
For the day of the Lord is come. Hallelujah, Lord God Almighty. Hallelujah, Yeshua is King. Blow a trumpet in Zion, sound it on the mountain. Blow a trumpet in Zion, for the day of the Lord is come.
Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. We are excited, although I'm a little concerned we might have some technical difficulties, but I'm waiting to find out. Today we have a very exciting exploration of one of the greatest images in all of Jewish history. It's the sounding of the shofar on Mount Zion, with Israel on Mount Zion, on Mount Sinai. Let me slow down a minute. We're looking at this incredible picture, and it's not just the astonishment of the story that we're looking at. It's the imagery that pervades all of Jewish history, several Jewish holidays, not the least of which is Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but also Shavuot and Sukkot. All of these holidays have something in common, and they have mountains, mountaintops, and they have scriptures assigned to them on each of these Jewish holidays that remind us that there's going to be a shofar from heaven that will one day call Yeshua from his seat at the right hand of the Father, where he is seated in heavenly places until he makes his enemies his footstool. And so we are amazed. Let me make an adjustment here. Okay. Hold on. Okay. If you think it was scary at Mount Sinai, you should see my office sometimes. So anyway, we're looking at this incredible moment in the history of the Jewish people. And so I want you to read the text with me. I want you to look at this passage. It's the Torah portion Yitro. It's the third day, and the shofar blast, and Adonai descending. Now this is what is remarkable. So first we're going to look at this. We're going to look at this from a learning point of view. Why is this imagery so important to the Jewish people? Because it is the eternal hope of the mountaintop experience. We've talked about this before. It's what inspired Martin Luther King Jr. when he said, I've seen the mountaintop. I've been to the mountaintop and I've seen the other side. This mountaintop imagery in Scripture has inspired many people, many believers from every culture in history, because it speaks of things to come. It speaks of eternal things to come. So let's look at this one part. We've looked at the Torah portion all week in our nightly walk through the book of Exodus. And this morning we're going to only look at this one part of the passage and see if we can make some sense out of it. So it says, on the morning of the third day, this is the 50th day. This is actually the first Shavuot in history. And this is what actually took place on Shavuot. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder, lightning, and a thick cloud on the mountain. Then a shofar blast sounded so loudly that all the people in the camp trembled. Moshe brought the people out of the camp to meet God. They stood near the base of the mountain. Mount Sinai was enveloped in smoke because Adonai descended onto it in fire. Its smoke went up like the smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain shook violently as the sound of the shofar grew louder and louder. And Moshe spoke, and God answered him with a voice. And Adonai came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and Adonai called Moshe to the top of the mountain, and Moshe went up. Now, this imagery is really powerful. This is not mankind's shofar. This is not the Levites blowing the shofar. This is a shofar, at least it's implied, from heaven. This is a shofar that was louder than anyone had ever heard a shofar before. It also is accompanied with enormous lightning, huge cloud, a pillar of fire coming down on the top of the mountain. It was a state that was so fearful that even Moses said he quaked in fear. And what God said to Moses is this: I'm not trying to scare you, but I want you to have a healthy fear of God. He gave them boundaries, he gave them warnings, he gave them instruction. At the beginning of God raising up, in a sense, discipling our people. From this moment on, he will begin to teach them the Torah. He'll instruct Moses, and Moses will instruct the people of God. Now, on the holiday of Shavuot, there is a passage that is read, not on the Torah portion today. The Torah portion is a different Haftorah portion for today, for Yitro. But on Shavuot, when we read this same text on Shavuot, because this is when it took place, I want you to see what we read on Shavuot. And this is what we read. Let's bring it in here. Okay. This is what we read. On Shavuot, we read Ezekiel. Hold on a minute. Let me fix it. Okay. I'm going to learn how to do this eventually. Okay. Let me make that a little bit smaller. Okay. So I want you to look at the passage. When we celebrate Shavuot, the Haftorah for Shavuot is Ezekiel chapter 1. So let me give you a clue. It was Shavuot in Acts chapter 2 when the Spirit of God was poured out. And we're going to look at that too. All right? But look at what they were reading. So think about Acts chapter 2. We've been studying the book of Acts on Thursday nights. In Acts chapter 2, this is an amazing scene, and it's taking place at the temple in Jerusalem on Mount Zion. It's taking place right there where all of the nation is gathered after Yeshua had died and risen from the dead on the third day. And then, which is the third day, the story in Exodus is said, prepare yourself for the third day. And if ever there was a prepare yourself for the third day in the history of the Jewish people, it was Acts chapter 2. And it was the same third day in the retelling, on time, in time, for all time, the retelling of the story of what took place on the first Shavuot on Mount Sinai, most likely in Arabia, where at the time the Midianites lived. So what we're looking at here is the Haftarah for Shavuot. Notice the parallels to the story. Now, if you were in Acts chapter 2, if you were in Jerusalem when this was taking place, you would have been in the synagogue. You would have heard the text that we read. You would have been in the morning service, and you would have read the text of Shavuot, the Haftorah portion. The Torah portion would Exodus 19 and 20. And so look at what they would have read in Acts chapter 2. In the 13th year, on the 5th day of the 4th month, while I was among the exiles from the Kavar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, see, this is a warning. This is a warning about Tisha B'Av, because it's a text we read on Shavuot. But the event that Ezekiel's talking about was on the 5th day of the month, right? Heavens were opened and I saw a vision. 13th year and the 5th day of the 4th month, which is actually the month before Tisha B'Av, and there's another holiday on Tammuz that is also a fast day. It's also a fast day, as well as Tisha B'Av, and it's amazing how all these events seem to bring about similar pictures, similar imagery, for us to understand what will be the culmination of all things one day when Messiah returns to the Mount of Olives. So think of this, in Acts chapter 2, what took place at Mount Sinai is taking place in Jerusalem at the temple. They read Exodus 19 and 20, and now they're reading Ezekiel 1 and now they're also reading Ezekiel 1. In the 13th year and the 5th day of the 4th month, while I was among the exiles from the Kavar River, the heavens were opened and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, which was during the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's exile, the word of Adonai came to the Kohen Ezekiel, son of Butzi, in the land of the Kasdim, the Chaldeans by the Kavar River. There the hand of Adonai was upon me, and look at what he saw. I looked and saw a windy storm approaching from the north, and a huge cloud with flashing fire, glowing brightly all around with the color of gleaming amber, and within the fire. Inside there appeared to be 4 living creatures who looked like human beings, but each one had 4 faces and 4 wings. These are angelic figures. And we see this imagery all through the Bible, including in the book of Revelation. Their legs were straight with feet like calves' hooves. They glittered like burnished bronze. Beneath their wings they had human hands on their 4 sides, and the 4 of them had faces and wings on as follows. They touched one another with their wings. They did not turn when they moved, but each moved straight forward. And listen what motivates them to move forward. As for the appearance of their faces, they had human faces in front. The 4 had lions' faces on the right. Each of the 4 had a bull's face on the left, and each of the 4 had an eagle's face toward the rear. Thus their faces. As for their wings, each had 2 that stretched upward and joined those of others, and 2 more that covered their bodies. Each living creature moved in the direction of any of their faces, in whichever direction the Spirit, in whichever direction the Ruach wanted them to go. They went without turning as they moved. Thus the appearance of the living creatures, and with them something that looked like a fiery coals burning the way torches do, with fire flashing here and there between the living creatures. The fire had a brilliance, and out of the fire went lightning. Do you see the familiarity with our Torah portion? Ezekiel is seeing exactly what was taking place in the days when Babylon was getting ready to judge the nation of Israel. He's seeing a vision that is very similar to the vision or to the narrative in Exodus 19 and 20. What's present? Lightning, wind, sound of many waters, the sound of the shofar, the flashing of light between the living creatures, and the fire had a brilliance. Out of the fire went lightning, and the living creatures here and there were like flashes of lightning. And maybe we'll stop there. So as we look at our Torah portion, let's go right back and look at it. On the morning of the 3rd day, there was thunder, lightning, and a thick cloud on the mountain. Then a shofar blast sounded so loudly that all the people in the camp trembled. Moshe brought the people out of the camp to meet God. They stood at the base of the nation. They stood at the base of the mountain. And Mount Sinai was enveloped in smoke because Adonai descended onto it in fire. Its smoke went up like the smoke from a furnace. The whole mountain shook violently as the sound of the shofar grew louder and louder. Moshe spoke, and God answered him with a voice. Now I have my Bible. I want you to turn to Acts chapter 2. If you've been missing our Bible study on Thursday nights in the book of Acts, you're really missing an important part of real Messianic Jewish theology. The book of Acts is the Jewish timeline of the good news going from the Jewish people to every kind of Jewish person in the world, and then God opens the door to the nations. And I want you to listen to these words. Notice the symmetry. I mean, really listen to this. And I'm just gonna want you to listen. Don't be distracted by the passage. Chapter 2 in the book of Acts. When the day of Shavuot had come. So Shavuot, Yeshua, it's the 50th day after Yeshua after Yeshua was risen from the dead. It's now 10 days after Yeshua is ascended into heaven. It's the 50th day. It is Shavuot in Jerusalem at the temple. Now, they just read Exodus 19 and 20 in the sunrise service, the Shacharit morning service in Jerusalem. In that service, after they read the Torah portion in Exodus 19 and 20, they then read the Haftorah portion in Ezekiel chapter 1 that we just read. And then this is the narrative from Acts chapter 2. When the day of Shavuot had come, they were all together in one place. Suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. Now that whole house is the common name for your house, my house, but which is also the term in the Torah, prophets, and the writings, and the New Covenant scripture for the house of God, the Beit HaMikdash, the house, your house, my house, Beit, your house, my house, HaMikdash, your house, God's house, using the common term for your house, my house, to describe God's house, Beit HaMikdash, on the mountain. And what's happening? I'm going to read it again. When the day of Shavuot had come, they were all together in one place. Suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. That whole house was the temple grounds in Jerusalem. Not an upper room a mile away from the temple. If they were in an upper room a mile away from the temple, they would have been complete disobedience to how Yeshua taught them to observe everything Jewish, every Jewish holiday, every Shabbat in temple or in synagogue. They were observant Jews. The last thing that disciples would ever imagine is to be late for the Shavuot service on Shavuot at the temple after Yeshua gave them specific instructions. Do not leave Jerusalem, but wait here until the promise of the Father which you have from me takes place. So as they were sitting there on the temple grounds, in fact, the text implies that the morning service had just finished. They had just heard Exodus 19 and 20, Ezekiel chapter 1, and they're walking out into the courtyard, and what they heard took place in Exodus 19 and 20, and what they heard read in Ezekiel 1 in the Haftorah portion for Shavuot now begins to manifest at Mount Zion in Jerusalem. I'm going to read it again. When the day of Shavuot had come, they were all together in one place. And all together in one place means with the rest of the nation, observant Jews that were waiting in the temple. After all of the controversies of the last 50 days, everyone in Jerusalem was talking about the disciples. Everyone was talking about what had taken place with Yeshua, the resurrection of Lazarus, the healing, the signs and the wonders. And now the claim that Yeshua is risen from the dead. The town is turned upside down, inside out, in Acts chapter 2 on Shavuot. When the day of Shavuot had come, they were all together in one place. Suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the whole house, the Beit HaMikdash house, where they were all sitting. Tongues like fire spreading out appeared to them and settled on each one of them. And they were all filled with the Ruach HaKodesh and began to speak in other tongues as the Ruach enabled them to speak out. Now, how do we know that that's the temple? Well, we know the common word Beit, your house, my house, Beit HaMikdash, God's house. But something else is important to understand here in Acts chapter 2. Verse 5 of chapter 2 says, "Now the Jewish people were staying in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven." So who is the crowd that is there with them in that one place? Devout Jews from every nation. Devout Jews who speak many different languages. If you meet an Uzbeki Jew here in New York, and there are many, they speak that language. It's a different kind of Russian language. If you meet a Russian Jew, they speak Russian. If you meet a Sephardic Jew, they speak Spanish. If you meet a Jew from the Greek islands, they would speak Greek. They would also know Hebrew because they're observant Jews. But they were all together in one place. And people, when you put all together in one place in the upper room, you miss the whole point of the story. That what God did at Mount Sinai before the whole nation of Israel, men, women, and child all saw and heard the same thing. God is doing that kind of a work in Jerusalem, at the temple site, in Jerusalem, before the whole nation of observant Jews who are there because they felt compelled to be there in obedience to the Torah. Because Shavuot is one of the 3 pilgrim feasts of Israel: Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. So, when the day of Shavuot had come, they were all together in one place. Who's together? All the Messianic Jews, not just the disciples, but all the followers who were with the disciples. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. And who was sitting with them? As the tongues of fire spread up and appeared on them and settled on each one of them, they were filled with the Ruach HaKodesh and began to speak in other tongues as the Ruach enabled them to speak. And now Jewish people were staying in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven. And when this sound came, the crowd gathered. They were bewildered. In other words, there was an immediacy. Immediately this happened. And they gathered to watch where the fire was descending. And it was descending on the heads of a small group of people who apparently all had spent 3.5 years with the Messiah. They were bewildered because each was hearing them speaking in their own language. And they were amazed and astonished, saying, "All these who are speaking, aren't they Galileans?" Aren't they Galileans? Think about that. How is it that each of us are hearing in our own birth language? Not foreigners, Jews born in other nations who were there for Shavuot, and they were observant Jews because they obeyed the Torah and the prophets and the writings. That 3 times a year they would make pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So Acts chapter 2 verse 7, they were amazed and astonished, saying, "All those who are speaking, aren't they Galileans?" How is it that we hear each of them? Each of us are hearing in our own birth language. How are Galileans? How are we hearing what Galileans are saying in our birth language? Medes, Persians, people from Mesopotamia, Cappadocia, wherever they were from, Crete, wherever they gathered in from the region, and the nations they lived. And listen to the list. How is it that we're here, our own birth language? Parthians and Medes and Elamites, Jews living in Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt and parts of Libya towards Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jewish people and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them all declaring our own tongue the mighty deeds of God. In other words, there was absolutely no one here except Jewish people from wherever we've been scattered. What they have in common is they were observant Jews who were observant enough to know that they had to drop what they were doing wherever they lived and make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Passover, which means they saw the death and resurrection of Yeshua. For Shavuot, which means they now are about to be present for one of the greatest divine appointments in the history of time and space. The outpouring of the Ruach upon the disciples of Yeshua, and 3,000 people committing their lives to the Messiah as the true Messiah of Israel, who came, who died, who rose from the dead. Who rose from the dead. And we are amazed at the juxtaposition of all these events that are taking place before our very eyes. It goes on to say, they were all amazed and perplexed, saying to each other, what does this mean? I hope some of you are saying that. How can this be anything remotely called a coincidence? That what took place on Shavuot, the first Shavuot at Mount Sinai, and how it took place, lightning, thunder, the voice of God speaking, fire coming down, everyone hearing at the same time the voice of God, men, women, and children. The whole nation that was led out of Egypt and brought to Mount Sinai. Nothing like it in the history of the world, where every Jewish person, maybe the only time in history where every single Jewish person heard the voice of God at Mount Sinai. Now, every Jewish person present for Shavuot in 33 AD are having the same experience. What does this mean, they said. Others poking fun were saying they are full of sweet new wine. Peter stood up and said, he raised his voice. Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them. Fellow Judeans. Who was together in one place? The Messianic Jewish followers of Yeshua, their disciples, the whole rest of the observant Jewish community, which means they were part of that observant Jewish community that was present on Shavuot 33 AD in Jerusalem. And he addresses them, Peter addresses fellow Judeans and all who are staying in Jerusalem. Let this be known to you, and pay attention to my words. These men are not drunk as you suppose, for it's only the third hour of the day. It's only 9 o'clock in the morning. Shachrit began at 6. It just ended a few minutes ago, and they're all in the courtyard, the enormous courtyard of the temple when this took place. So Peter tells us the time of day, which places it directly. Well, while we go to our own egg after our service, they were in the courtyard after the Shachrit morning service at the temple in Jerusalem in 33 AD. These men are not drunk as you suppose, Peter said. It's only the third hour of the day. I thank God that was written down. That's why I love Luke. He really was observant about what took place and gave us important details. But this is what was spoken about through the prophet Joel. And it shall come to pass in the last days, says God, that I will pour out my Ruach on all flesh. Your sons and daughters shall prophesy. Your young men shall see visions. Your old men shall dream dreams. Even on my slaves, male and female, I will pour out my Ruach in those days, and they shall prophesy. And I will give them wonders in the sky above, signs on the earth beneath, blood and fire and smoky vapor. Wow. Little further down in verse 22, he says, men of Israel. So who is Yeshua speaking to? He addresses them. Men of Israel, hear these words. Yeshua HaNatzrati, Yeshua of Nazareth, a man authenticated to you by God with mighty deeds and wonders and signs God performed through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. Well, he's talking to a group of people who were there for Passover. They saw all the controversy. They saw the triumphal entry of Yeshua into Jerusalem. They read the scriptures on the Sabbath before Passover. The one whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Malachi 3:1. They saw it. So he's referencing, he said, you know what took place The layers and layers and layers of the language of Acts chapter 2 takes us out of this mythological segregating of the gospel from the temple, segregating the gospel from the Jewish people. Somehow it's transformed into a Gentile story. The Jews rejected Jesus, but the Gentiles from every kindred and nation accepted him. That is just not even plausible. It's virtually impossible to get that out of Acts chapter 2. What you get is an identification of who's there, observant Jews, the places they're from, the fact that they all speak languages where they were born in those nations, and that they're all hearing that because Galileans are speaking and they're hearing the good news in the language where they were born. So then Peter, in verse 22 of chapter 2, says, men of Israel. Now, here's what's interesting. The text does not say that they had any less ability to hear. It says that we are hearing the glory of God in our own language. And there's no indication that they stopped and said, what's he saying? No. The same miracle that took place when they began to worship with cloven tongues of fire upon their head. In the same way the fire came down on the mountain, the same way the wind came in like rushing waters, the same way there's the sound of the shofar stirred people up that something supernatural was taking place. And now, after they're all hearing this good news and the praises of God in their own language, Peter is the only one speaking, and he's standing up and he says, wait, everybody listen to me. Men of Israel. All the people still heard what he said. In other words, it wasn't the miracle wasn't he was speaking all these languages at once. The miracle was they were all hearing what he said. In whatever language he spoke it, they were all hearing it in their own language. And this is the proof that it was a hearing miracle, not a speaking miracle. The word hearing is the word Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Shema Yisrael, the one thing God wants us to hear. Wow, I'm excited. How could you not be excited about this? The fundamental, the most important phrase, even when I was far from God, I went to shul my whole life as a kid. And as lost as I was when I was 18 to 20 years old, I was searching for God, crying out to God. All I could do when I was having difficulty was I would say the Shema. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha u'v'chol nafshecha u'v'chol modecha. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And I would say these things in stresses and struggles as I was seeking God and saying, Lord, reveal yourself to me. I don't understand. And what does it say here? Acts chapter 2, men of Israel, hear Shema, these words. Yeshua HaNatzarati, Yeshua of Nazareth, a man authenticated to you by God with mighty deeds and wondrous signs from God, performed through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. What does the you yourselves know mean? It means he's talking to the same group of people that were assembled in the days of Yeshua's death and resurrection, because they came to Jerusalem for the pilgrim feast of Passover, and it's a 7-day holiday. There's 2 Shabbats. Read the story of Yeshua's youth. He went up to Jerusalem as a little boy, 12 years old. It's a journey. It's a season of time. And then they all go home. Then they all come back for Shavuot. So this same crowd that saw the signs and wonders that Peter's now referencing and saying, you saw it with your own eyes. You were here and you heard about Lazarus being risen from the dead, 4 days in the grave. You saw him crucified. You saw him buried. And on the 3rd day, he appeared to many of us. The scriptures affirm 500 people at one time saw him risen. And then he ascended into heaven from another mountaintop, the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, just across from Mount Zion, in Jerusalem, into heaven, to be seated at at the right hand of the Father until he makes his enemies his footstool. So back to Acts chapter 2 for a moment. This Yeshua, given over by God's predetermined plan and foreknowledge, nailed to the cross by the hands of lawless men, you killed. But God raised him up, releasing him from the pains of death, since it was impossible for him to be held by it. For David says this. I'm not going to read it, but it talks about the fact that he will not see his body decay. But David did decay. He did get buried. So who was he talking about? This is the descendant of King David. The one who would not decay, but would be risen on the third day. Shall we go back for a moment to our Torah portion? On the morning of the third day, it's a different third day, but it's emphasizing third day. When they ask Yeshua, what are you talking about? You're going to die and rise from. What are you talking about? Build this temple in a day. What are you talking about? He said, destroy this temple, referring to his body, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And they said, oh, he's going to destroy the temple and raise up the temple. But it says he was talking about his body, that he would die and be buried. Erev Pesach, and the day after this Passover was over, after Shabbat, the resurrection took place after, no resurrection on Shabbat. After Shabbat. God is an observant Jew. I mean, he taught us to do what he wanted us to do, and we did it, and he did it in time, on time, for all time. And there was thunder in Exodus chapter 19 and 20. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder, lightning, and a thick cloud of the mountain. The shofar blast sounded so loudly that all the people in the camp trembled. Don't you think the people in Acts chapter 2 trembled? And just like verse 19 of Exodus 20, verse 19, as the sound of the shofar grew louder and louder, Moshe spoke, and God answered him with a voice. In Acts chapter 2, God spoke prophetically through the men who were standing there with cloven tongues of fire upon their heads. They were like a neon sign in the crowd. Who did they look at? The ones where all the sounds of the rushing mighty waters, the sound of the wind, the sound of the ruach, the fire that came down, and where did the fire stop and remain? Upon the heads of Yeshua's followers. And they were speaking, and everyone heard it in their own language. This Yeshua, given over by God's predetermined plan and foreknowledge, which, by the way, how can anybody blame anyone for killing Yeshua when it was God's predetermined plan that he would come and die for the sins of the world? Come on. This Yeshua, given over by God's predetermined plan and foreknowledge, nailed to the cross by the hands of lawless men, you killed. But God raised him up, releasing him from the pains of death, since it was impossible for him to be held by it at all. Risen from the dead. Nothing in history like this has ever taken place. No one has ever risen from the dead to remain alive through all time. It's absolutely, pardon me, it's absolutely the singular event of resurrection. Only happened once. Only one person is alive forever. And who was alive before even forever begins. He was alive before time. He came in the likeness of sinful flesh. He died for the sins of the world because he was worthy to die for the sins of the world. He rose from the dead on the third day. And on the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning and a thick cloud. This is the penultimate expression of how God gets our attention, which I would like to remind you, this pandemic has gotten our attention. I also want to point out that if you've really been a student of these studies since this pandemic began, then you would know this. You would know that this pandemic began when we closed our synagogue on Purim. We weren't able to celebrate Passover and Shavuot. And this this entire time that we've been in this quarantine, or in this season where we've been kind of shut in, God has been speaking to people's hearts all over the world. It's a sign and a wonder that God, like the lightning and the thunder and the power of God on the mountain and the earthquake. Please, Lord, no earthquakes. The pandemic is okay. We hear you. We Shema. We hear you. Israel, hear God. Shema Yisrael. Adonai Eloheinu. Adonai Echad. Lord, help us to hear your voice that you are so clearly speaking, to reveal Yeshua as the Messiah of Israel and the Savior of the world. Now, before we close, I want you to see this imagery is so powerful. Remember, all of this imagery that Peter is referencing in Acts chapter 2, he says, you were here, you saw it, you know what happened, you were here during Passover. But guess what? There's 3 pilgrim feasts of Israel: Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And so when we go, what do we read on Sukkot? Zechariah 14. Let me find it. I want you to turn to your Bibles to Zechariah 14. I think I have it here on my screen somewhere. Let's see if I have it. I think I do. That's Ezekiel. Let's see. Close that. I know I had it. There it is. This is what's called the final harvest, and it's Sukkot. And this is from the Message. Look at this. Notice that time and place prophetically matters. The God of Israel. This is a message from October 3rd. I think it was just this past year. In October, this past October. The final harvest. So Passover to Shavuot, first harvest. Sukkot, final harvest. 3 days. 3 solemn feasts. Supernatural signs and wonders. And what do we read on Sukkot? Look at this. Follow along with me. I want you to see it with your own eyes. This is what we read on Sukkot. Look, a day is coming for Adonai. Your plunder. Jerusalem will be divided right there within you. I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem for war. The city will be taken. The houses will be rifled. The women will be abused. But half the city will go into exile, but the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. It will be one of the darkest days in the history of the world. It will be what the Bible describes as the last event of the end of days before Yeshua comes. And watch what happens. In the midst of this final war, where the nations turn their back on the nation of Israel, here we read this on every Sukkot. Look what happens. And let me just take you back for a moment. Notice this. What happened on the first Shavuot? There was thunder and lightning, thick cloud on the mountain. The shofar blast sounded so loudly the people in the camp trembled. Notice what it says. God descended on the mountain. Verse 18, Mount Sinai was enveloped in smoke because Adonai descended onto it in fire. Its smoke rose up like the smoke of a furnace. And look at the text with the prophet Zechariah, who happened to be a post-captivity prophet while they were building the temple that Yeshua came to. He said, then Adonai will go out and fight against those nations, fighting as the day of battle. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which lies east of Jerusalem. That's the same place he ascended into heaven on the 40th day. The exact same place. You can't have more of a transcendent Jewish story than the enormity of these images that we're reading about today. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. Still future fulfillment to come. So even if there is a war in the Middle East, don't worry about it. Yeshua's coming. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which lies east of Jerusalem. And the Mount of Olives will be split in half from east to west to make a huge valley. No one will be able to make a false prophecy about this. This will be the most obvious fulfillment of prophecy in the history of the world. Because for it to be a fulfillment of prophecy, the mountain has to be split in two and pushed apart, just like the parting of the sea. Except it's going to be a parting of this mountain right in the middle. God's going to part the mountain. He's saving this great supernatural event as a sign to all the nations that is unmistakable, absolutely can't miss it, can't say, I don't know, we've seen this before. Mountains split apart all the time in the valleys. There's an earthquake. You could make any rationalization you want. But in the midst of this war, the one thing that will separate this, not only will the sign that the mountain has been pushed apart like this parting of the sea, but who shows up? Yeshua stands on the Mount of Olives. Now look at this. And notice what goes with it. Half the mountain will move toward the north, half of it toward the sea. You will flee to the valley and the mountains. For the valley and the mountains will reach to Atzel. You will flee just as you fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then Adonai, my God, will come to you with all the holy ones. Same kind of supernatural sound that came at Mount Sinai will now be coming from the heavens again. And Adonai will come to you with his holy ones. On that day there will neither be bright light nor thick darkness. And one day known to Adonai will neither be day nor night, although the evening there will be light. Unmistakable supernatural experience. On that day, fresh water will flow out from Jerusalem half toward the eastern sea, half toward the western sea, both summer and winter. Then Adonai will be king over all the earth. Over the whole world on that day, Adonai will be the only one, and his name will be the only name. Now we have to close, so I want you to hear these words by Steve McConnell. Listen to these words.
A time is coming, his word does say, by Yom HaHu, in that great day.
Day.
A day that is coming by Yom HaHu. Wrongs will be righted when the prophet's word comes true. In a day that is coming by Yom HaHu. And in that day we'll see the feet of Messiah stand on the mountain in Jerusalem. And in that day we'll have no need for a candle. The only that there'll be is him. Yom HaHu, Yom HaHu, a day that is coming, but Yom HaHu.
God has made it clear. Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot are the sign festivals of Israel that everything God promised will come true. Isn't it time? Isn't it time to ask God to open your eyes, to turn to God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength today on this Shabbat? By Yom HaHu, in that day. How about today? How about today? If you've been sitting on the fence about whether or not Yeshua is the Messiah or not, you looked at these passages with me. These are not coincidences. This is the sovereign God revealing Yeshua to us in the most profound way. Now listen, we have to stop now. But I want to tell you, ask Yeshua into your life. Commit your life to him and write to me at info@shuva.com. And don't forget to be a blessing. In these days of this pandemic until it's over, wouldn't it be amazing? Listen to what I'm saying. I said this a year ago. I said, wouldn't it be amazing if it's on between Pesach and Shavuos that this virus ends? I think there's a possibility that could happen. I'm not saying thus saith the Lord. I'm saying it's a real possibility that can happen. God knows what he's doing. He knows how to reveal in signs and wonders that it's him speaking and not us. Ask Yeshua into your heart today and be a blessing, and we'll see you tonight at 6 p.m. for our walk through the book of Exodus. God bless you. Shabbat Shalom in the name of Yeshua Mashiachenu ben Adonai